You are listening to a Clarkesworld Magazine podcast with your host and narrator, Kate Baker. Greetings, Clarkesworld citizens. I hope this podcast finds you very, very well. It is August 2017, and you know what that means. It means a brand new month of stories. And as I usually like to do at the beginning, I want to implore you to support the magazine, please. Don't make me beg. Okay, I beg every podcast, but still, don't make me really beg. The simple gist of the matter is, we can't do this without you. And I'm not exactly sure what's been going on, but we saw it last month too, where people are pulling their pledges. And we understand if it's a financial matter and you can't afford to support us at this point in time. I hope you do come back. But if you are on the fence or you haven't just gotten around to it, I can't express to you enough how important it is that you go to patreon.com/Clarkesworld Magazine and show your support somehow. $1. It's less than a cup of coffee a month. Come on, guys. Anything helps. And who knows, maybe we'll actually reach a threshold where I'm not sitting here begging every month for money. But that's all up to you guys. You know I love you. And if you are a continued supporter of the magazine, in a monetary or word of mouth, or you buy an anthology at a table, you are amazing. Thank you. So our first story for the month of August 2017, issue 131, is titled Twisted Knots and is by D.A. Xiaolin Spires. D.A. Xiaolin Spires stares at skies and wonders what there is to eat out there in the cosmos. Spires aspires to be a 3D printer, replicator, gourmand, but will happily concede with producing and consuming quixotic fiction and poetry. Trips to East and Southeast Asia continue to influence her writing and leave her craving durian, fermented foods, and copious amounts of wonder that fuel her body, spirit, and imagination. She currently lives in Taipei, Taiwan. You can find her huddled in a mosquito net, speeding through night markets and trudging up the Escheresque subway stairs scattered across this urban landscape. Her works have appeared in various publications and are forthcoming in magazines such as Analog Science Fiction and Fact, Lontard Journal, and Retro Future, as well as anthologies of the strange and delightful such as Sharp and Sugartooth and Ride and the Starwind. So I hope you can sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. Lillian attached yet another Mobius strip to her underwater diorama. Undulating in blue, they crisscrossed in gossamer nets across the shoebox, a miniature biosphere where sharks and fish roamed. Yet, these waves, as Lillian pronounced them to be, seemed more alive than the animals that hung in them, thought her mother, Xiaolin. No one expected 6-year-olds to finish their own science projects, and Xiaolin found herself wrapped up in another one of her daughter's assignments, taping invisible strings to the top of the cardboard box. Lillian helped her mom weave the hanging model sea creatures made of fine crimson silk cloth, usually reserved for the outfits of only her mom's most exquisite carved puppets. Even as their family pinched pennies for clothes and meals, buying only used t-shirts and cheap biendong lunches in Flushing's Chinatown, Xiaolin felt her daughter's education should not be something they stiffed on. When Xiaolin ran out of extra fabric in the cupboard, she made discreet cuts from the robes of her cast of characters, taking in the outfits of flying swordsman Hui Ting, evil renegade Qi Ha, court princess Xin, and some of the court attendants, a snip here and there to become another octopus or luminous piece of coral. Later at night, when the honks and general hubbub from outside died down and Lillian's dad finally returned from his day laborer job to eat cold rice congee dinner, Xiaolin sat on the sofa set to closing up these omissions in her puppet's garb, as Lillian brushed her teeth for bed. Lillian brushed her teeth in continuous arcs without lifting up her hand, a strange habit she picked up from long ago as Xiaolin could remember. "Tell me a story," said Lillian when she was done. Her green eyes would sparkle and dance behind her glasses. It was her nightly demand as the family princess. Every night, Xiaolin would succumb to Lillian's wishes. Lillian, in second-hand polka-dotted pajamas, watched the dead eyes of the Budai Kushi suddenly animate. She would laugh as the old man next to the sea would fall into the waters looking for his cane, and gasp as the princess jumped out of her palace and onto tiled roofs, her delicate gown behind her. In her hands, she would play with one of the Mobius strips she always had lying about in the room, running her fingers along the path that never seemed to end, even when the play came to an end and the moon whispered it was time for bed. In Lillian's cubicle hung 5 Mobius strips, 1 from when she was very young, and 4 from the course of her teenage years to her present 24-year-old adult life. Each represented a pivotal time in her life, but she rarely talked about them, just as she rarely spoke much in general. On her desk sat a lump of pink flesh marinating in a thick, clear gel on an antiseptic tray. Beside the hunk of flesh balanced several fine-tuned battery-powered lasers against the edge of the tray. These Lillian used to manipulate the flesh, as crucial to her trade as scalpels are to surgeons. In the corner of her desk was a small photo, faded and worn and slightly blurry, barely recognizable, as the breathtaking court princess puppet, Si. Lillian turned on the laser and changed the intensity of the green stream that suddenly appeared on the flesh. The bright laser drove a straight line directly onto the pink blob. A searing smell of roasted meats wafted toward her as she chiseled first in vertical lines, then filled the rest of the canvas with her signature uninterrupted loops. "Good job, but be careful that the marbling matches the visual stock," said Ken, her supervisor, as he walked by. Lillian just nodded without comment and continued scrawling with her laser. She could hear Ken saying at another cubicle, "You might want to try holding the laser at a different angle." Ken always had to make some comment, as if worried that his presence would be superfluous without an unnecessary pointer. Every day he made a few rounds with at least one reminder to each employee. Lillian's co-workers called her an artisan. The steaks she created resembled the Angus they tried to reproduce, like no other cell-cultured product. Lillian made these sears with pursed lips and furrowed brows and took no more joy in their production than turning on her morning coffee machine. She saw it not as an art, but as a rote, mechanical job. Neither was she doing it to save livestock from the cruelty of the modern meat industry, as others working in her field have proclaimed as their raison d'etre. In fact, here she ate more live steaks than ever, as a form of taste test and comparison. Her company even had a monthly allowance for real steakhouses in the metropolitan area, which she took advantage of without remorse. She often invited Josa and put her steak on the bill. Instead, what fascinated Lillian was topology. She loved the whorls of continuity, idiosyncratic shapes that seemed to defy nature itself. Tubes that wrapped in among themselves but never ended. She pictured herself as an ant crawling through those tubes for eternity. Sometimes she would glance over at her Mobius strips dangling against the gray dividers and imagine herself as a tiny puppet pulled by invisible hands stuffed within, or pulled by a set of gossamer strings perched from above, alongside the Mobius strip surface pulled toward the endlessness that lay before her in repeating loops over and over. She put this picture in her head as she detailed the commercial meats, these wedges of flesh that had never rested on any bone and had never been held in a hand of a butcher. She heard the light ring of a bell, slid her finger past the power sensor, and put down her laser. She'd finish the rest of the raw hunks after lunch. "I call it the sound of emptiness inside," said Lillian. She was 16, sitting cross-legged and pushing her index finger against a plushy piece of dough. It moved, striking another equally dense fried piece of dough. "I don't get it," said Josa, short for Josephina, Lillian's best and only friend. "I don't hear anything." "You're probably just used to all the noise in the restaurant," said Lillian. Josa's dad would often take her daughter to the dim sum restaurant in Flushing where he worked as a manager. Sometimes they'd invite Lillian to the restaurant too. Josa's dad would treat her to beef noodle soup, something that was not on the menu, but he would yell out in Spanish to the chefs to make it for the staff. He said he craved it growing up in Texas next to a noodle stall. Lillian would chew on the beef, thinking of how stringy the ligaments and connective tissue were. At the time, she didn't know what it was that made these fibers get stuck in her teeth. "I don't think hearing some plates clatter's gonna make me deaf," said Josa. She made a tentative jab at the doughy circle herself. Then she touched one of the mugs dangling to its right. "Wouldn't it be better called Firefighter's Breakfast?" Lillian said, "It actually would be better called Taurus." But Josa was too absorbed in picking out the green sprinkles of the vanilla frosted to take note of the term. "I wonder if I should move up the left." Lillian's voice trailed off as she watched Josa pull one of the donuts from the floss string holding it in place. A cut formed on the side of the ring where the floss pulled through it. Then Josa took a bite. It was raspberry frosted with sprinkles. Josa said it tasted vaguely purple. "Oh no, Josa, you ruined it," said Lillian. Lillian thought of the imaginary tiny little puppet running across the surface donut, looping in and out of the hole, never stopping to rest. Then she imagined a giant finger pushing against the donut, squishing a mug hole into one end, while the donut hole served as the handle. Now with Josa's slice through the ring, these abstract illusions were destroyed. "Oh, you'll get over it. Here, have a donut," said Josa. She pulled another one off its string, tearing it as well. This time it was double chocolate glazed. As Lillian munched, Josa asked the questions, their typical interaction. "Is this thing supposed to make a sound?" asked Josa, gesturing towards the hanging donuts and coffee mug. "No, it's a mobile. You're thinking of a wind chime." "A mobile? Like one of those old cell phones?" "No, not mobile, a mobile." "Mobile," said Josa, exaggerating the long E vowel. "What's it for?" "It highlights the shapes and the movement of each of the pieces, creating an aesthetic composition," said Lillian. "Oh, I get it. My baby sis, Gabriella, has one. It stops her from crying, but hers is made up of monkeys, giraffes, cute animals like that, and has lullaby music. Have you thought about putting music to yours?" "No, not really." "How about a jingle about a complete breakfast?" "No, it's not about breakfast." "A coffee mug? Donuts?" "They're homeomorphic," said Lillian. "They are spaces that can be pressed into one another without cutting or using glue, like taking Play-Doh and working it." "Oh, you're talking about those shapes again," said Josa. "Well, spaces really," said Lillian. "The shape is secondary." "It's a good donut," said Josa. "Next time don't let it hang so long before inviting me over. It got kind of dry." Josa clapped Lillian on the back, then she passed her an electronic chip the size of a fingernail. "I put some music on this. It's for our social studies skit on the Spanish-American War, but you could probably use it for the mobile. It sends a pulse that I think would make the mobile spin. Hang it up with it and watch the shapes move along to the tune." After Josa left, Lillian taped the chip to the mobile. She activated it with her phone and watched the homeomorphic breakfast entities dance in the wind to the fast beat of Spanish hip-hop. For a moment, she thought she saw a glint in the air, something that felt like the room pulled in on itself. But even before she could put a finger on it, It disappeared. That was the night her dad asked for a divorce. 7 months later, her mom left her with $500 and a note that her mom was returning to her native Taiwan without her. Go to Miss Lee's. She will be taking care of you from now on. Lillian wondered if it was her own playing with spaces that had breached something in the air, something in the space-time continuum that made the world turn upside down. Like hanging from the top edge of a donut hole, seeing the world topsy-turvy, flipped and warped to something unrecognizable. Lillian wedged herself between two rather large butts in the empty subway seat. It was early in the morning, and her stocky neighbors on either side held twin paper coffee cups. She was wearing white trousers and simple, flat pumps. Now these white trousers were sandwiched by neighboring legs of black work trousers. She imagined seeing it from a bird's eye view. She was always good at changing her perspective to see things. Their legs would look like an Oreo, she decided. She had opened the novel she was reading, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, a suggestion that Josa had sent over. Lillian liked the way books could screen herself from the world. She liked the heft of the book. But most of all, she liked how she could fold herself in there, wrapped up into a story, like time-warped, nudged, and shaped into a convincing form, much like her topological spaces. Much like puppet plays, she thought. But then put it out of her mind, like she always did when thoughts like that popped their way in. She had started taking classes in the nearby university on topological spaces alongside her job. Work during the day and classes in the evening. She barely had time to shower. After her parents left her, she convinced herself that she had to be practical and make a life for herself, because no one could take care of herself but herself. She put all thought out of her mind to be a mathematician and instead focused on biology. She could work in a lab, make a steady income. Mrs. Lee was always pleasant to her, but never treated her like a child. She knew once she hit 18, she was out on her own. In the end, she majored in biological illustration. There was an artistic side of her that loved curves and spaces that she could not chase away. She interned as a technician for a museum, where they hired her part-time. It was Josa, who she kept in touch with even throughout college, that found her a job in the artificial meat industry. A hint from her dad, who rose to own a few classy chain restaurants in Queens. But now, sitting in this tiny crevice under the fluorescent lights of the subway car, staring over the pages of her book at the heads nodding asleep, she rethought her plan for life. Wasn't there more than simple existence? She thought of puppets that played out heightened moments of drama and passion, how wonderful they could live so fully, even if inanimate, even if only in tales. Then she tossed the thought out of her head as she continued where she left off in her novel. The subway jerked as it passed yet another stop. She followed Joseph Cavalier's flight to America from Prague. She imagined her mom's flight the other way, from her fallen-apart marriage to Taiwan many years ago. The novel spoke of magic, and she thought of her mom, the sole budaikashi puppet master instructor in Queens, making the puppets come alive when she was just a kid, breathing animation into otherwise mere fragments of wood and cloth. Every time the novel mentioned Golem, she felt a restlessness in her. Golem, the beginning of clay that could be given life with a mere name. She searched for Golem on her phone. Emmett, the words that breathed him to life. Her hands shook as she dropped her phone onto the shiny shoe of the man sitting next to her. Ow, she heard, not daring to look up, and saw some droplets of coffee splash onto her phone. She breathed a sorry just as the owner of the shoe picked up the phone to hand to her. She finally looked up to stare into the eyes of a man with shaggy brown hair who looked uncannily like evil renegade Siha, down to the same sour grin and all from her mom's puppet days in Flushing. He was wearing a pink and yellow striped tie against a white button-down and holding a cup of coffee in the other hand. Lillian dropped her glance and peered instead into the Windsor knot at his neck, her mind racing, following the bends and loops of the narrow silk path. She caught herself staring. She plucked the cell phone from his open hand, wiped the coffee splashes off its screen on her pant leg, and rushed to the subway doors. The scratchy broadcast told her the next stop was hers. She dashed through as the doors pulled open. Something felt right about the golem. Something felt true, like allegorical tales her mother would weave when she was a little older, in her teenage years. In her head, she heard her mother's voice recount the story of Buddha Kaishi, puppetry before bringing to life each new fabricated tale. 300 years ago, in Qianxihao province, in Fujian, a talented student named Liang Binling nearly lost heart from failing the imperial exams. These were exams whose passage was required to become a government official. He heard of the legendary Xiyangyong Temple at Nine Carp Lake and the ability of its deity to predict the direction one's life would take. Moved by this talk, he visited the temple and prayed to the deities. That night, in his dreams, one of the deities wrote in the palm of Li's hand, "Gong Mingzi Ha Kuo." Achievement lies within your hands. Upon awakening, joyous with this knowledge, he took the exam again only to end up failing. Frustrated and dejected, he decided he wouldn't take the exams anymore. As he was walking down the street, he came upon a stage for puppet theater. As he watched the puppets dance, a thought struck him. He would carve his own puppets, use his own hands to move them, if not anything but as a means to wash away the tides of his chagrin. His own crafted screenplay would accompany these puppets. Little did he realize, this was the seed for an art form that would grip his audience and the many to come after him, and lead him to this eventual success and achievement, riches and fame. Her mother would then look up at Lillian, grasp her right hand and trace a series of indecipherable character strokes in her palm. Her mom's hand was warm, her fingers light. Lillian felt sure these words conveyed something important she could not grasp, as her mom let out an enigmatic smile. Did the puppets come to life much like the golem? Did her mother really breathe the essence of the living into them? Or was it her own imagination? The haziness of her earliest memories colored her thoughts, and she couldn't distinguish fact from fiction. But as much as conviction told her that the notion of the golem was real, conviction equally accorded her the certainty that it wasn't from a written utterance or word. It wasn't Emmett. She was convinced it was not a word. No, she didn't trust words. They were imperfect. Everyone had different intonations, different lilts. Just tongue, tips, and teeth coming together. Achievement lies in your hands, she thought. She fiddled with her Mobius strips. No, it was a space. It was an arrangement of space. Lillian knew from the pit of her gut, radiating outward to every fiber of her being, that should a golem exist, it would be brought out through topology. Valves that kept going forever, circulating the flow of qi. If she could only harness it. She spent the next few days chiseling out the spiral spectrums on her hunks of meat, thinking of the many stories her mom told her. For the longest time she thought them only painful memories, but now she realized there might be something important in them. She replayed the flying swordsman's Wei Ting, whipping out his double-edged blade and spiraling toward the rogue warriors. She heard the pleading of evil renegade Qi Ha, a man she perhaps met on the train days ago, or at least his doppelganger, a mortal enemy asking his life to be spared. And most of all, she revisited the heartfelt romance in martial facility, of court princess Xi, who was capable of compassion and strength all at once. She could feel Xi's light steps on her swan wings, graceful slaps that would paralyze those who betrayed her. Her touch would also heal the innocent simply from the purity of her heart. And of course there was the fire-breathing dragon glittering in its many arrow-proof scales. Lillian never thought it strange before, but now suspected that this rain deity was made fire-breathing by her mom catering to an American audience. For days, she thought of these tales, and she carved fake meat with her laser, with only Ken's bumbling critiques as interruption. She imagined the puppets reenacting fights, tumbling sheets of fabric thick with adventure and drama and threatening voices. Then she would fuel her imagination with evenings in topology class, listening to her professor's nasal voice drone on about quantum topology, the light of his laser pen shining at twisted knots. Much like her own laser teasing knots into the stem cell dough in front of her. The pink meat so much like the mud flesh of the golem. And just like that, on an unusually hot, sticky spring day where her sweat cooled under the high fan of air conditioning, she felt, like the way the brain folds into wrinkles, the fleshy stem cell dough fold into sentience. The secret was never the whispered word, but a kind of topological perfection that the universe bowed to. Sensing the sentience, as qi flowed within this mound of meat, Lillian's heart couldn't help but palpitate. She thought of the beauty in which gravity bent space-time. If forces could manipulate and bend dimensions, then the rendering of physical matter into certain configurations could possibly bend the dimension of consciousness. The meat, a proto-brain, as she deemed it, pulsated with life. She seared it into whorls and shoots, a number of pervious pockets as well as continuous grooves. As she prodded the piece of thinking meat with a soft measuring apparatus to test its pliability, she couldn't help but think that consciousness was simply a dimension where sentient thoughts exist. It was a matter of pulling matter into the right curves, and as an entryway into this dimension. Energy allows consciousness to move, she thought. If energy was broken, flow wouldn't be directed the right way. Continuity without breakage as key. As she had done it. She had unlocked the key to consciousness, the path to the dimension of this existence, through a kind of homologous act. All it took was imprinting the hunk of lifeless flesh with a homeomorphic form, representing the space of the dimension where consciousness lies. Not an easy feat, but she fulfilled it nevertheless. She wiped off a bead of sweat from her brow, hid her work in her drawer from the wandering eyes of Ken, and proceeded on another piece of meat. She seared this raw meat, the usual way for artificial beef, so she could fill her employment quota and not raise Ken's suspicions. After she was done for the day, she took her coffee mug and filled it up at the machine. Ken gave mugs to all the employees that said, "Cup of Joe for workers ready to go." She stroked the whole of the handle with her fingers, an impeccable Taurus. She took a sip of the hot liquid, conspiring her next move. "Hey, Joseph, I need a favor." Lillian cradled a phone to her neck. "Let me guess, RAM or hard drive?" Joseph's husky voice sounded strained. "Neither. Is this a bad time?" asked Lillian. "No, I'm just working on this head. I can't get the ears to screw in right." "I see," said Lillian. "So, what is it that you need?" asked Joseph. Lillian could hear a soft, periodic grating sound and imagined Joseph holding down a robotic ear, sandpapering away the softer notches around the titanium latch as she had seen her do in person. "A Mimeo shell?" said Lillian. Dead silence. "Hello?" said Lillian. The grating sound continued after the pause. "Yeah, I heard you. I think. Did you say Mimeo shell? You want a body?" "Yes." "Are you kidding?" "No." Jose's questions made Lillian feel more at ease. At least her request wasn't so outlandish that Jose hung up. She could do that sometimes, too, hang up if she didn't care to talk to you anymore. But Lillian knew that 9 times out of 10, Jose's curiosity would win over reservation. Okay, tell me what it's for? Lillian spent 3 minutes filling her in. It was the most she had spoken in a month. Jose listened with rapt. And it's alive? Asked Jose. Sentient, I believe, is the word you're looking for, said Lillian. If this wasn't you, I wouldn't believe it. So will you do it? There was a pleading lilt in Lillian's voice. She used that supplicating tone on Jose when she needed to borrow money for mobiles and other projects she poured her heart into. She knew Jose couldn't resist it. I'd have to ask, said Jose. Lillian pressed further. Here, think of it like this. You want to spend your whole life working on soulless shells that sit in reception desks, telling visitors where the bathroom is? Or do you want to see your creations come to consciousness? Lillian hung up with Jose, with a promise from Jose to lend a head only if she got clearance from her partner. Luckily, Jose was dating the head funder, a formidable Clarissa Cale who made the calls. She'd have to give Clarissa a convincing reason. Jose wouldn't lie, but Lillian hoped she'd at least round off the details to make it sound like a little less loony. It worked. The golem flexed real, animate fingers, with articulations at the joints. It batted expressive eyes to match. Sentience. A soft stream of viable life coursed in a hard titanium alloy body. But even as Lillian was reveling in this success, the golem plotted its own adventure. In a few days, it made its escape to Taiwan. Lillian didn't know how it happened, but she found herself on a plane with 3 layovers, with even more borrowed cash and a mouthful of apologies. Oh, poor Jose, her head's on the line because of me. Which is why she would get him back, no questions about it. Lillian checked the phone at her Frankfurt airport connection. He's landed at Taoyuan Airport. He's heading south, getting on the high-speed rail. Both Jose and Lillian had a hard time thinking of him as an it. When they slipped that pulsating red proto-brain in the cranium cavity and it connected its tissue with clamps, she saw a spark light up in the golem's cavernous eyes that she had never seen in any of the humanoid robots that Jose had crafted before. Lillian's fingers flew as the other hand conveyed sausage and fries to her mouth. Okay, I'll be boarding in half an hour. We'll be on the chase. Luckily, Clarissa had the foresight to order Jose to put a GPS on the body, a small chip behind the ear. After Lillian landed, she grabbed a taxi, ran to the high-speed rail from its drop-off point, collected her ticket that Jose bought online, and took her the first train south. Passengers brushed up against her, and she knocked over someone's suitcase. Crowded, no seats were left. It was Qingming Festival, days set aside for the sweeping of the tomb. All of Taiwan was on the move, headed to ancestors' graves to burn joss paper and offer porcelain cups of tea and wine, to pay respects and placate the departed. It seemed ironic that rather than traveling for the once living, she was following the lifeless that came to life. But she knew why it was happening. She had left her mark on her creation, a Frankenstein that had a volition of its own but still followed ingrained patterns, predictable like an ant running on a track of spatial loops. Through her topological bending of space, Lillian endowed the golem with her own prejudices. There were numerous forms or continuous roads that led to perfection, and Lillian's own rendering was a signature mark, like Picasso's blue period or the swells and curves of Gaudi's work. The consciousness had her trademark on it as legible as someone's penmanship that slants left with wide loops. And her imprint led her to the most deeply seated longing. Her mother. Broken Chinese and some sprinkling of spoken Hokkien, and copious text messages from Jose led Lillian to a small village at the southern tip of Taiwan. Lillian pushed through a crowd and planted a seat onto the puddle-ridden lawn. It rained earlier and the ground was thick with mud, the cold wetness seeping into her shoes. Lillian wrinkled her nose. The air smelled dank, mud mixed with incense and jasmine flowers. The sun had set, and the darkness was a perfect backdrop for the stage lighting that fell on an enormous architectural feat built in front of the village temple. It seemed like a remote place for a production of this kind, but from the gossip of surrounding towns, she learned of her mother's fame. They called her, in spoken Hokkien, Po Te Ti, Queen of Budakashi. It had to be her mother, even if she had taken on a new stage name. Xin, court princess, the star of her own story, even though her mother used different characters to write it. Instead of happy harmony, she used fragrant ceremony for her new epithet. It seemed fitting, sitting at her production, the stage performance, a ceremony amidst the aroma of burnt incense. As Lillian stared into the stage, all the interlaced voices of Mandarin and Hokkien around her hushed as the lights dimmed again and rebrightened to signal silence. The curtains opened to reveal a backdrop of Mobius strips. Her eyes fell on a jungle of diaphanous bands, loops hanging off loops, in all different widths of silk dyed in all shades of red, from a gentle blush to a fiery scarlet. She witnessed in her hard chair an emotional tumult of a play about a mother leaving a child, of financial necessities, dreams shattered, of being haunted by loss. It was nothing like the dragons and palaces and adventure of the kind she was used to as a child. She abided twists and turns and moments of penetrating revelation. It pulled at her insides, played her as if she too were a hand puppet. Her mother's guilt and agony working into her limbs called upon her to move, pulled her chest closer to the stage, her thumping heart drawn like gravity, as if space itself had collapsed and bent between where she sat and where her mother must be, somewhere behind that stage. She realized, for what it was. It was her mother's own command of topology, not through lasers and the prying at meat, but a subtler but more comprehensive manipulation. It was the whole air around her, circulating, passing about, the audience absorbed into this dimension just as she was. Her mother's skill was not employed to put consciousness where none lay, but to imbue consciousness where consciousness already resided, to breathe life into those already living through the production. Her mom gave soul through the gliding gestures of the lavishly carved puppets. Lillian realized if she could map it out mathematically, the hand gestures, their movements across the stage, the peaks and valleys of their sorrowful songs, it would sum up to continuous tunnels and loops, the kind that had awakened her very own golem. But it was more expansive, more expressive than her own. Years of experience and pain accumulated into something much more powerful, a dynamic link to this dimension of consciousness. And the last scene, as the light dimmed, a child returned. Lillian squinted at the stage. It was her golem, dressed up in a wig, what looked to be 4 layers of robes. It stood out from the carved wooden figurines simply from being there, from a stony existence. It didn't even seem to move, but its eyes gleamed a wild, impassioned blackness, as black as a space in donut holes, in black holes. It was the prodigal daughter, somehow alive even though it made no movements. Lillian could feel its sentience, its neural activity even under its stage cues of inertness. She suspected the rest of the audience could too. It was a cold impact, the fiery eyes mixed with silent paralysis. In the end, she never saw her mother. She couldn't stay to watch the puppet masters come out from behind the scenes. She left with a cocktail of emotions, pain and resentment, but also a kind of tender respect. Perhaps her mother had enchanted her through a mathematically rendered spell, put into stage once more just like when she was a tiny child. She returned back to the U.S. and quit her job. The golem eventually followed her back. She had fed it neural instructions via a wireless connection with Josa's help before she left. Lillian and Josa started up their own business. It involved robotics and topologically enhanced meat as neural network for their creations. It was a small company catering to a very exclusive and covert clientele. It would be an understatement to say that they encountered quite a few ethical quandaries. One day, Lillian's mom, Xiaolin, now known as the talented Xi, found in the mail a series of large packages and a script for a puppet production. She flipped through the pages of the script and came across a set of characters, one she contemplated with nostalgia. The tale was about a family broken apart, ran asunder, about a main character growing up with foster parents that never loved her, and about the beauty she found instead in mathematical principles and higher, loftier kinds of truth. How the hollowness of a continuous tube can substitute maternal caress. It was a harsh script, but with moments of poignant comedy. 2 weeks later, on a cloudless night, when the moon shone to its fullest capacity, Xiaolin, now Xi, took out these neurologically enhanced robots dressed up in period garb to a tiny seashore stage on an isolated island in the outskirts of Taiwan in the midst of the Pacific. It was a small audience. Behind the curtain, the laughter of locals drowned out the sobs of a mother. When the play ended, she bowed and returned backstage. Before she changed out of her qipao, she turned to one of the dolls, black-haired, green-eyed, only mechanical, but she felt she could sense real warmth behind the embrace. I think as artists, whether it be writers or puppeteers or any sort of creative mind, I think our whole drive to create comes from imbuing work with life that wasn't there. And I think what the story is ultimately trying to tell us is that we drive from our experiences in our life, and we put everything that we are and everything that we've experienced and everything that we want to be into these works of art. And I think that's why for some of us who listen or who read stories, depending on what is happening, we identify because we can relate on some level. How did you relate? You can leave us a comment or a question at the Clarkesworld Magazine website itself, or you can go to the About Us page, where all of our contact information is listed. Thanks for spending this time with me. I hope you come back for another story in August. Until then, I bid you a very fond and warm au revoir, à bientôt, adieu, aloha, and every other word that means please come back and listen again very soon.